Okay, welcome to this Innoasis Science Talk, which has the title Nudging, the Art of Positive Manipulation. So this is the fifth Innoasis Science Talk. We have done a monthly series. It was supposed to be live, but we started up during Corona, so they have all been digital so far. But the good thing about that is that we have a wide variety of participants from all over Norway, but also some international guests. And the Innoasis Science Talk, that is a collaboration between the Smart City Cluster Nordic Edge and also the Smart City Research Network at the University of Stavanger and the Future Energy Hub at UIS. My name is Helleik Syse, and I work as the project coordinator for Future Energy Hub at UIS. So just to give you some background about what these science talks are. So really what we want to do here is to take a scientific topic and have a discussion based on that, and also related to what does this imply for people and also industry and the public sector. And I'm really looking forward to today's talk and discussion. This is a topic of personal interest, the topic of nudging and behavioral economics. We'll discuss what influences how we make choices and also what the research show about that. And there could be some surprises there. My first introduction to the topic of nudging was through the excellent podcast Freakonomics. And even though I'm an engineer by training, I quickly became interested in this topic, which is the topic of behavioral economics, which combines knowledge from psychology and economics. And what, in my opinion, makes it so interesting is that it relates so much to daily life, and you can actually see in your own choices and in your own life how this research applies to you. So the program for today is that we'll first get a talk from Ola Kvanløy, who is Dean and Professor of Economics at the University of Stavanger Business School. That will be approximately 20 minutes. And after his talk, we have a highly competent panel of individuals which have worked with nudging from different angles. They will each give a 5-minute presentation about their background and how they have worked with nudging. After that, we have half an hour to discuss Ola's talk and how different people in the panels think about nudging. And just to introduce the panel as well, today's panel consists of Mats Simonsen from Ducky, Benedict Brinchmann-Eie from Footprint, and Knut Ivar Karavoll from Risk Insight. And at the end of the talk, we have 50 minutes with questions from the audience. So feel free to ask your questions in the comments along the way, and hopefully we'll have time to attend to all of them. So with that introduction of the program, I would like to introduce today's speaker, which is Ola Kvanløy. Ola Kvanløy is Dean and Professor of Economics at the University of Stavanger Business School. He received his PhD from the Norwegian School of Economics in 2003, and is also affiliated with NHH as an adjunct professor. Kvanløy specializes in the field of organizational economics and behavioral economics. He has worked extensively on incentive theory and contract theory, in particular trust-based relational contracts. He has also done experimental work on incentives, motivation, and risk-taking behavior. So with that, I would like to introduce Ola, and the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Helleik, and thank you so much for inviting me to this meeting and to give a talk. So I'm of training an economist, and that and I learned economics in the 90s. And when you are trained as an economist, you also learn that it's a behavioral science. It's about people making choices, economic choices. But our benchmark model that we use is that people are rational, so they maximize their lifelong utility, and also that they are self-interested. They care about themselves and only themselves. Now, this field of behavioral economics, which is the kind of scientific underpinning of the nudges, is really a field that challenges these assumptions, challenges rationality assumption, and challenges the assumption of self-interested behavior. And it is in particular the assumption of rationality that has motivated research also on nudges. And I will use my minutes here mainly to talk about the kind of scientific background for nudging, and then I will say a few words about the standard nudges and some concluding kind of remarks or reflections on it before the discussion. Let me share some slides I have. Let's see. Okay, you see my screen now? Yes?
Yes.
So let me begin here with an example which is unfortunately feels relevant today. So think about, imagine that there's in the US it's preparing for an outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed, and assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences of the program are as follows. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. And if program B is adopted, there's 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. Now, which program to choose? This is, of course, a hard ethical question, and there's no correct answer. It depends on preferences. But in this situation, most people will actually choose program. Usually I would have asked you, what do you think, what kind of program would you have chosen? Now it's a bit, it's not that easy in a digital way, but so let me just move forward and say what people typically choose here. Well, people typically choose program A because people are risk averse in standard settings, and also think, okay, it's important to save 200 people for sure. Now, but there is a variation, of course, in people's preferences, but most people ask answer A in this question. Now, if we look at the problem in a different way, it says actually exactly the same here. The disease is expected to kill 600 people. We have 2 alternative programs. C is adopted. 400 people will die. Now, program D is adopted. There's 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. And you probably see where I'm going now. So what most people answer to this question is that they would go for program D. Instead of letting 400 people die for sure, it's better to take risk to avoid loss. But what you also see is that the two programs, A and B, or A and C versus B and D, is exactly the same. We have just rephrased the question. So it's not a new, the problem that we are looking at here is exactly the same as the one we had in the previous slide. It's just how it is framed. Now, when people typically ask D here, it is because we are risk-seeking in loss domain. When we look at different choices that refers to potential losses, then we are willing to take risk to avoid the loss because we are loss averse. And this is a very important insight from Kahneman and Tversky, that you may have heard about. Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who also was a psychologist, worked extensively with Amos Tversky, and is one of the founders then on behavioral economics. And an important insight from this is also that the reference point is important on how you see a problem. Where you stand is important from how you see a problem. Whether you see a problem as a gain domain or a loss domain, and what is the status quo? Where do you stand now compared to a change of situation? And it also gives rise to what sometimes is called a status quo bias, because of a change might give some upsides and some downsides. And if you are loss averse, you don't like the downside. So there's a tendency of status quo bias. But most importantly now in this setting also is to establish that we have bounded rationality. So people who answer these questions, they actually were people working at hospitals, doctors and nurses, and also bureaucrats. It's a classical task, what I showed you, and you really saw these inconsistencies in how they answered, which is then due to also some bounded rationality. And in behavioral economics, one sometimes talk about the 3 bounds. We have bounded rationality. We also have, as I will point to now, bounded willpower. And we have a bounded self-interest. So we are self-interested, but we also have this kind of willingness to care for others. And this bounded rationality and bounded willpower makes us humans and not econs, as Richard Thaler said it. And as you know, Richard Thaler is then the author of this book that I will come to, Nudge, called Nudge. But before I come to this book, let me then also say a few words about what bounded willpower means. So if you look at this problem, you prefer to pay a bill of 50,000 kroner in 2 years rather than 100,000 kroner in 4 years, which is natural. But you may still prefer to pay 100,000 in 2 years instead of 50,000 now. This is what the credit card companies make a living of. It means that we have what you call time inconsistent preferences. So how you value 2 versus 4 years ahead is differently from how you value today versus 2 years ahead. This also contrasts with the standard way of thinking in economics, when you when you look at investments decisions that you make, a project that you want to undertake, then you do analysis of the net cash flow, and you discount the future, and you have what you call standard exponential discounting. But people do not behave like this. So this standard exponential discounting implies what we call then time inconsistent preferences. But it runs counter with this old theme that people have limited power of self-control. Because there is more discounting, and when I mean discounting is how you discount and reduce the value of the future, because everyone cares more about today and about the future, but it is particular. But today has just a very high interest to us, and the discounting between today and tomorrow is much higher than tomorrow and the day after. So Thaler and Scherfen proposed a planner-doer model. In the model, a person has 2 selves, a myopic doer and a far-sighted planner. And the planner is concerned with the maximization of lifetime utility, while the doer cares only about current utility. So to maximize lifetime utility, the planner can either force the doer to reduce current consumption by applying some willpower that may be costly to you to apply, or impose some rules that limit the range of doer discretion. So we are not the econs who are purely only rational. we have willpower, self-control challenges. So, and the plan is then trying to constrain and incentivize the doer to maximize lifetime utility. So as an example, if you think of buying potato chips, you care about the health, but you also care about having a nice time in front of the Netflix in the weekend. So what do? The econ buys 2 and consume 1 each weekend. So the econ, the rational person. The doer buys 2 with the intention of consuming only 1 each weekend, but end up eating both first weekend. While the planner buy 1 to avoid eating both the first weekend. And this is a kind of and this is also even mathematical models that they proposed, and there was a lot of research on this early in the stages of behavioral economics. And when Richard Thaler then came with this book, bestseller book Nudge in 2008, it was really trying to get these kind of insights to the crowd. So the solution to the problem of willpower problem and also bounded rationality problem is sometimes to do small nudges, small things that can make it easier for people to make correct choices for themselves. And it's important that, as one see here, that one make choices which make the choosers people better off as judged by themselves. So it's not manipulating people to do other things that they want to do, but it's helping them to make choices that they themselves evaluate as better. And this is called liberal paternalism. And a prominent example is this pension saving program that they have in the US, where they do not have this mandatory retirement saving. Saving for the future is hard to do. So they make commitment plans where you say, I will save more tomorrow, not today, because it's not that nice today, but you say you will save more tomorrow. And how do you do that? You commit to spend some of your future increase in the pay to save for retirement. So it's not directly a loss because you get this extra pay in the future, and then you have committed to save some of it. And as you know, and also why we are having this meeting, this got a lot of attention. And also one got some what they call it nudge units. The first was in the UK with David Cameron, like this approach, because from a liberal side, one may not like that much hard regulation, constraining people's life directly, but more want to give people themselves a choice, and then set up what they call choice architecture to make it easier for people to do good choices for themselves. And also Barack Obama had a similar initiative in the US. So what are the nudges then? What kind of things do one do? And here I'm sure many of people in the panel also have more examples than me. But let me just categorize them in the kind of nudges that you typically see. One is to set the right default, because in choice situation it's often possible to do nothing. And this is often the choice then that people choose, of the status quo bias, and also of course problem of getting enough information and so on. So default setting is extremely important. And there are many examples of this. Some also in health settings, and whether now it's a choice that you have to do the vaccine, but the default for children is to have it, and then you have to say that you will not have it, for instance. Inform about the norm. We may have wrong perception of what is normal behavior, and maybe also mistakenly believe that we are following a norm. So by informing about actual average behavior, one can also change people's behavior significantly. A lot of interesting research on this. I mean, just some examples. So if you want to increase tax income, then you may also, and for some countries this is a challenging thing, then one may say what other peoples do. 9 out of 10 pays tax on time. You now belong to a small minority who do not pay taxes on time. There's also interventions on informing about energy use, electricity use, saying what you do compared to other peoples in your neighborhood. Also, ranking and comparing with others is an important. One can discuss if it's really nudges, but the interesting thing with hard incentives, monetary incentives, compared to just ranking, is that it turns out that you can really motivate people with rankings, even if you don't reward rankings with incentives. Showing how you do compared to others, showing how the schools do compared to other schools, and so on, turns out to be important way to improve performance. So and this is often used also in public policy in Norway. As we saw in the initial example, how we prime and frame, and in particular how we frame things, is definitely relevant. For Homo economicus, the rational agent, it doesn't matter, but for us normal people, it matters how one frame a choice. And so if one want to help people make choices that we believe and also can know that they want to make, one must frame things correctly or in a good way. And a nudge is also then to make some kind of commitment plan, so that the planner can kind of incentivize and constrain the doer. And this smart pension plan that Richard Thaler proposed in the US has also shown to be extremely effective for increasing people's saving plans. So I see my time is approaching, but some kind of remarks in the end. I have mainly concentrated here on the kind of scientific background for nudges, but on a more political level, why this has been so important for Western and countries, and why like UK and US is particularly interested in this, has to do with the question, how can we achieve some societal goals without compromising too much the freedom of individuals. And liberal paternalism is in a way a contradiction in terms. It refers to this idea that the authorities can make it easy for people to make good choices for themselves, as judged by themselves, without resorting then to tougher forms of regulation. I saw in the ingress of this meeting also, and one asked, is it manipulations? Well, I think one can of course call it manipulations, but at least public policy nudges are and should be transparent. So we can say, for instance, one nudge is that we let people pay some taxes each month, and we even give them less tax before the summer and before the Christmas. And we are transparent on why we do this. It helps people actually save. So transparency, I think, is important. Some things that are more bigger interventions that one often do, like in education, one does in the educational field in school, one does larger behavioral interventions in order, for instance, to motivate pupils. We have researchers at the University of Stavanger who has done that, made interventions to give pupils a growth mindset, believe in themselves, and so on. This is interventions that sometimes turns out to be very effective and can also be more effective than more standard tools of achieving goals. I don't know if it's correct to call them nudges. So mega nudges or behavioral interventions, you could call it. It's also important to note that some of these interventions are not necessarily as important for its own sake, but can guide us for how for the future. And much of policy that is carried out is you try out some policies, but you don't do it in a systematic, experimental way that you can do with that researchers do. And if researchers are allowed in the field to make interventions or nudges, then one can get more causal good evidence. Some research show that nudges have a tendencies to be a bit short term. So it works immediately, but then the effect slows down. And this in contrast to more hard regulation that this is effectful all the time. Some of the critique against nudges is also that it may remove the politician's responsibility to really make hard choices, for example, on the environment. We cannot just tell and nudge people to care about the environment. Some hard regulation and taxes and so on are important, which of course I also think as an economist. So nudges, interventions, and incentives and regulations are not substitutes. They should be regarded as complements. Yes, I think this I have used my time, so yeah. I can maybe also stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Ola. It was good to have this background about the literature and how the topic of nudging emerged. So what we will do now is that we have 3 panelists with us today. They will each be given 5 minutes to tell a little bit about their background and how they have worked with nudging and behavioral economics. So the first person out is Mats Simonsen, and Mats is educated as a mechanical engineer, and he has a strong desire to contribute towards a more sustainable society, and therefore he started the company Ducky together with 2 co-founders in 2014. And Ducky consists of 28 ducks and ducklings who develop technology and services to inspire and empower individuals, municipalities, and companies towards sustainable habits that can change our society. So it's your floor, Mats, to tell a little bit about what you do.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Ola, for a nice presentation. It was really interesting. And sorry also for my name, Smoked Cinnamon. It's because we had some team buildings in Ducky, and I've tried, but I can't change it now. So that's me. But I'm Mats. I'm from Ducky, and basically I was part of starting Ducky 6 years ago. And what we started, it was going to the streets and ask people, why is it so hard for everybody to live sustainably when they see that climate is not really going great? And what a lot of people are saying is that they want to contribute, but you don't really see how you as an individual make a difference. And then at the same time, we talked to industrial ecology at NTNU, and they told us that all climate emissions and impacts actually come as the sum of us as individuals, because it's we who have the need for clothing that needs a factory. We need kind of transport, we need the roads, we even need the hospital and the army to cover our needs. So in essence, all climate emissions can be traced back to us, and we really need to tell people how we can actually then contribute and feel empowered to make something with that knowledge. So therefore we started making these kind of climate challenges. So in 2 weeks, we're actually starting up NMI Klima, which is kind of these high school championships where schools are competing to say who is the best climate school in Norway, what's the best class in each school, and what's the best student in each class. And what we do then is basically say that, okay, you can log manually climate actions such as biking to your school. You see that you are saving then 2 kilos of CO2 compared to the average. We translate it into a kind of something they can understand, and we make it kind of a fun challenge. And it was really cool to see how this is very much in line with what Ola is talking about, because you're kind of what you're doing then, it's basically to make this social pressure. So you make a social norm where people can see that, okay, living sustainable is fun. It's something all the others are doing. And we heard so many times that suddenly like the climate geek in the class becomes the cool one, because you are bringing points to your team and you can start talking about this as something positive. It's concrete and measurable, so you kind of get these signals that Benedict Stocknes is talking a lot about. For those of you who know him, you're part of the story. So okay, it's NM Klima, it's fun, it's in the media, it's part of the story that people are talking about, and you get a reward in the end. So it's kind of many of these kind of nudging elements which is in there and making this possible. But still, we saw that this kind of climate championships, if everybody in Norway did the same as these students, we could easily reduce our emissions with like 35% in Norway. And so what we do actually matter, but we see that we need to make this the default. So we don't really have the time to educate all the Norwegians, have those in kind of these challenges. So we need to change society in a much broader scope. And then, I don't remember your term, Ola, but was it liberal paternalism or something? Like we need to nudge all the society, meaning we had to kind of lift it to a higher level. And that's why we now started this project called Zero Emission Citizens, together with Asplan Viak and Tieto Every. So in 1 month, we are making the first minimum viable product where we will have a map of Norway. And in this map, you can see the citizen footprint of every region. So of Norway, from every district county, from the municipality and your neighborhood. You can see then, just as the COVID map, you can see, okay, my region or my neighborhood is bluer than the neighboring, and you can then see, okay, what's the difference, meaning that there will be a lot of social pressure, like why is our region worse than the neighboring, etc. So it puts pressure on the politicians and on me. So and then to really make this powerful, we are also collaborating then with banks and energy companies so that they can nudge you every day. So for instance, we are collaborating with SMN or Sparebank Alliance, which then give you, if you are a end user or a customer in this bank, you can actually then see your footprint every time you make a transaction, and the bank can then give you incentives to say, okay, hey, you are doing this well compared to other customers, you will get a reward, for instance, points or cheaper insurance in your bank services if you do this and that. So we are kind of now making a framework where we can experiment with nudging in a very large scale. And that will now be launched during this quarter, actually. So hopefully many of you are interested in the topic and want to kind of collaborate in how to make this really big going forward. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say in the introduction, at least.
Thank you for that, Mats. We'll just go straight to Benedicte. And Benedicte Winchman-Eie is a senior consultant at Footprint, which help brands and businesses to innovate and communicate to cut emissions and create values. She is a civil engineer by education with a master's degree in new product development and industrial ecology from NTNU. She has helped establish the Stordalen Foundation, the company Green Nudge, and the EAT Foundation, and several initiatives to promote circular economy in Norway. So welcome, Benedicte, and I look forward to your introduction.
Thank you. Well, I heard about nudging some 10 years ago when I helped found this small initiative we called Green Nudge. It didn't start out of an interest of psychology, but simply impatience. We had set up the Stordalen Foundation, and we were looking for a project to scale up and accelerate climate action. And the working title for Green Nudge was really Project Missing Link, or Bridging the Gap, because we saw that for a lot of climate measures, there was, and I would say still is, a gap between the solutions that exist and what is implemented, and what the people wanting to live more sustainably, and the choices they make every day. So we wanted to study how do we close that gap between theory and reality, and between attitude and real actions. So together with climate scientists from Cicero, we set up 2 initial studies. The first one was with Elkjøp, the electronics retailer. And we tested how and proved that better energy labeling and information in store could nudge customers to buy more energy efficient appliances. It would cut climate emissions, and the customers would save money in the long term. And the second was together with Nordic Choice Hotels about how to reduce food waste from buffets. And the hotels, they saw that 2/3 of all the food wasted from the hotels were leftovers from the guest plates. And we were told not to use PowerPoint, but I thought I wanted to show you this. Can you see it? Okay, it shows 2 different plates with the same amount of food. And with the bigger plate, it's easy to take more than you can eat. But smaller plates at the hotels helped reduce food waste by almost 20%. So the study showed that applying this nudge to all the 170 hotels, it could save more than 600 tons of food waste and 1,000 tons of CO2, and the hotels could save up to 30 million kroners without the guests even noticing. So I later left Green Nudge to help set up the EAT Foundation, but Knut Ivar, our next speaker, took over as the CEO, and he will probably tell you more about the nudges they did afterwards. But as I later worked with sustainability in fashion at H&M and as a sustainability and communications advisor for many different brands and retailers, I always come back to nudging because that gap is still very much there. According to Cicero, 8 in 10 Norwegians want to live more sustainably, but they find it hard to do so, just like Mats said. The IPCC, the UN climate panel, state that technology is not alone to save us from it can't save us alone from climate and environmental crisis. So we need behavioral change, and we need to find we need to make the climate friendly choices more convenient and more attractive. And ultimately, we simply want a society where green is the default. And to do so, we need all the green nudges we can get. So I like this session here. We need to spread the word and spread best practice, basically.
Thank you for that introduction, Benedict. It looks like we're still on schedule, so then I would like to introduce the last panelist, which is Knut Ivar Karevold. Knut Ivar has a master's degree in organizational psychology and clinical psychology from the University of Oslo, and a PhD in behavioral economics and economic psychology, also from the University of Oslo. He was a Fulbright Scholar postdoc at Harvard Business School, where he studied the behavioral science of nudges and group decision biases. Knut Ivar has more than 30 years experience as an organizational psychologist. So welcome to you as well, Knut Ivar.
Okay, so I got into the nudging area and met Benedict. I also met the founder of Green Nudge, Petter Stordalen, and he's a hardcore businessman. So he said to me, I'm not willing to fund Green Nudge anymore. I'm giving my money to the people in EAT. So if you want this, you need to make a business out of it. So I contacted one of the biggest food providers in the Nordic countries called Fazer Food Service. At that time, they had 1,200 restaurants. And their problem was that they had difficulties in switching their guests away from meat and towards fish and vegetables. So that was my first task. And I did that through doing a couple of experiments in the head offices of big companies in Stockholm and Finland. And the results were so promising that they decided to implement this through all their restaurants in the Nordic countries. So after that, I worked more with restaurants and supermarkets, and particularly with food. So at that time, we also had the benefit of working with Cass Sunstein, who wrote the book Nudge together with Richard Taylor. So he was our advisor and on the board. We also worked with another food professor, and he, in terms of talking about nudges, my expertise is mainly within food and transportation. So why is that so important in terms of sustainability? Well, about 60% of all emissions, 30% come from food, 30% come from transportation. So therefore nudging those choices are very important. So then I ended up with doing 2 scientific reports where we in one report found over 500 studies of food nudges. And those nudges are quite simple to understand. In terms of transportation nudges, that's a very messy area. And the people who have tried to nudge transportation have used many nudges at once, and they haven't done what we've heard already as smart, to use smart incentives. So I think when looking at transportation nudges, there's lots of good work to be done there. And I think it's quite easy to achieve more, but the science there is very unclear so far. But the science on food choices is quite clear. So to say what Ola said first with other words, we have 2 parts of our brain. We have the smart brain on top, and we have the primitive brain at the bottom. The primitive brain is the same brain as the Stone Age guy and Stone Age woman used to survive. They just walked around in the jungle and everywhere and grabbed the first thing they saw. So one of the first most effective food nudges is where you place the food. So people will, in a restaurant and supermarket, take most of what they see. Another thing that people do, that Benedict talked about, is that people eat too much. It's because the plates are too big and they just fill the plate. So if you reduce the plate size, they will eat less. The other thing is that you can draw people's attention through signs and arrows. That's the same thing as a Stone Age brain, you know, reacting to a red berry. Oh, it looks red, it looks good. Yeah, I'll take that. So in terms of food nudges, the 4 most effective ones are placing, meaning where the food physically is. It's labels, drawing people attention to the food. It's price. And this is an interesting topic. So if people want to, so Ola talked about snacks. So people want snacks. So if you increase the price of snacks, people will still buy snacks. But if you want them to buy more vegetables, if you reduce the price of vegetables, they will eat more. But if you increase the price of vegetables, they will eat less. So price works 2 different ways. And the last one is portioning. So in English, you have placing, you have prompts, which are signs, you have price and portioning as the universal nudges. So so in terms of how I place myself in this group of introductions, I'm a bit like Ola. I'm a scientific trained person, but I'm also like Benedict and the Ducky people. I like practice. So I transform practice, science into practice. And in terms of food, I've done lots of experiments, and they basically show the same, that placing is the most effective thing. Appeals to the Stone Age brain. People will eat what they see. And in terms of what Ola talked about regarding freedom, what we found in the big Potzer study was that some people were initially angry at not finding the meat in front of their face. But if they took away the meat, people got very angry. But if we said that the meat was in the corner and they can just walk a few meters more, oh, that's okay. I'll just go and find it in the corner. But overall, we reduced meat consumption, I would say, with 1/3. We doubled the fish and quadrupled the vegetables.
Yeah, so that's interesting to hear. Oh,
To confuse you about transportation, this is almost like hearing bad jokes. Okay, so last year I was asked to look at how do, what do you call it in English? Bompenger, what's that?
toll roads or?
Toll roads, yes. How do that influence people? Because in Norway, some people were just extremely raging angry for introduction of the toll roads around Stavanger particularly. That was, people would go out at night and dress up like criminals and tear down the poles, and they got really, really angry, and they even formed a a national party against toll roads. So when I looked into this to see how do the toll roads incentivize people to move more or less by car in cities, it was just completely confusing. So last year, what they did in Oslo, the following regulations. So imagine that you live in Oslo. Should you use your car or your bike or walk? Well, they doubled the number of stations from 20 to 52. And then they doubled the number of payments from only paying going in to paying going both ways. But then they also formed 3 toll road rings. So if you had to pay 3 times instead of once, but you had to pay going in 3 times and going out 3 times, but only if you spend more than an hour in the city. But if you spend more than an hour, then you would have half price going out. And then you would pay more in the morning and afternoons. But if you travel a lot, you would have half price for more than 120 passes per month. So all of this is, it was so much information and so many different rules that none of these qualified to a nudge. Because one of Cass Sunstein's main recommendations is that nudges need to make choices more simple. Take what you see, take what's labeled, take what's healthy, take what's sustainable. But all of these rules together made it confusing how to be sustainable. So therefore people would need, I think there's a big market for Ducky in Oslo. Simplify the toll system so people actually are nudged to drive less. Okay, and that's all.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Knut Ivar, and also for the insights into both food and transportation. So, like to sum up from my perspective, having all these talks and the introduction to Ola, so nudging is really all about how we can design the world so it's easier to make what we can label good choices, and it's more difficult to make bad choices. And nudging is in a way the technique of structuring choices so that it's easier to make them. And is immensely powerful. And it also shows that you have today, either if you work in a company or if you work in a municipality, the way you structure, the way people can make choices, it actually matters. So even if you don't pay attention to it, the way you structure it, the way you put out the food in a buffet, the way you shape society and shape buildings, it actually matters. But I want to raise a few topics. I have some questions that I think is quite relevant to bring up. We should ideally have multiple hours because there's so much to go into here. And as mentioned previously, feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we will have some time at the end to go through them. So we heard some good examples of how, and also now when I ask the questions, it would be easiest if you in the panel just raise your virtual hand, and we'll do your comments in the order you raise your hand. Does that sound okay? Okay, so the first question I, in a way, want to ask is, we know that how we as individuals behave is is really key to how we solve really big challenges like climate change, health challenges, economic challenges. But how much can we do through techniques such as nudging, which are these quite subtle ways to influence behavior? Is it enough? Of course, we need other, but does any of you have any perspectives on how much we can actually achieve through nudging? So Knut Ivar was first to raise his hand.
Yeah. So first of all, I actually worked in a company called The Climate Psychologist and not Risk Insight. I worked there too, but I'm here in the role as a climate psychologist. So many of you have heard about my colleague Per Espen Stoknes, and he's famous for climate denial. So why don't people want to do anything about the climate, even though it's a big problem that everybody knows about? And his explanations are the 4 Ds. So it's distance that will impact someone far away in a long time. It's doom. It's so bad we don't want to be hit by it. It doesn't match with our need to feel good. And it's easier not to think about it. It's convenient. So in that perspective, when we work together as climate psychologists, nudging is a solution, because think about the amount of energy we need to use to convince climate deniers that they need to drive differently, need to eat differently, to change their choices. And all experience shows that if you really believe something and someone tries to convince you through information or feelings, people will actually resist more. Because, you know, the toll road resistors, the climate resistors, their identity is in that we resist. We don't like this and we resist it. So therefore, the power of nudges is that we work through the subconscious, primitive brain and make it easier for everyone to make a better choice. You don't have to tell people anything. You can just, as you said, Helek, you can change the environment so that it's easier to move by certain ways. It's easier to choose certain foods. It's more convenient and practical. It saves you time. It tastes better and all those everyday things. So in terms of the big climate problem, we would, in climate psychologists, frame it as one part of the solution, but not the whole story.
Yeah, thank you for that. Also, I got a direct message from Mats, which have some trouble with his virtual hand, but he also had a comment to this.
Yes, so we are, like these days, we are talking to a lot of municipalities and even government about exactly this, like how can we influence our population to be part of the solution? Because we are actually we have committed to reach the Paris Agreement, and we can't just look at our regional emissions. Like we all realize that my consumption of this weather is happening in China and emissions are global. So we have to kind of work together on looking at the whole picture. So, but basically, I think like if we can reframe the story to say that, okay, this is not something that the politicians have to do or the industry, this is something we as a society do together, and we will do it in a way that will make us more happy as well. Like, yeah, today we are growing into this individualistic societies where we don't need to share, we can live in our big houses, etc. So we need to kind of reframe the story about like, okay, we can actually thrive and live happily if we share stuff, etc. So I think it's a part of, and what we have also seen like in the same sense is like, what can we achieve when we do this? Like for instance, with COVID, we saw that we have a common goal. We can accept tough climate policies as long as we understand it. We adapt because our neighbors does the same, right? So it becomes the social norm. So with all of this, like if we can tell the same story and we can have a common understanding, what is our goals, we can see progress, we can measure that we are reaching these goals, then I really believe that we can actually change society fast enough, like reduce our emissions with 10-15% every year and actually make it into something we can be proud of. So I don't think there is any limit to what we can achieve as long as we start now and tell the story in a unified way.
Yeah.
If I may, I don't find the virtual hand myself now. So
yeah, but it looks like both you and Benedict wanted. So yeah, go ahead first, Ola, and then
Go ahead, Ola.
Okay. Yes, it was very interesting listening to you with very nice and concrete examples and research you have done. So what I find interesting is that if you look at policymakers, often you see people who are working in the government and also as bureaucrats. They don't have that typical kind of behavioral background, and many of the things when you think about like marketing and more behavioral knowledge is more often used in business. And I also have had some contact with bureaucrats on behavioral interventions, and when they are economists and so on, that they think always in terms of incentives and regulation, and much of it is just about actually not call it nudging, but as you also said, Knut, make it easy and make communication easy and information easy. And I think some improvement also from a policy perspective can be made of having more of those people who think in behavioral perspectives in government and as bureaucrats, but because I don't. You see them not as often there. There are a lot of people from law and economics, and So that, I think that's also one way of getting this thinking into the policy for policymakers.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ola. Benedicte, you also had a comment.
Yeah, just kind of echoing what Ola said. I think we're naive if we think we can nudge our way to the Paris Agreement. But because of the scope of the challenge and the pace we need to reach, we need to use all the tools in our toolbox, not just the old school carrots and sticks, but the convenience. How do we make new defaults? We now live in a society where the climate intensive choices tend to be the default. How do we switch that to make it easy? So I think we need to broaden the debate on what incentives we use.
Mm.
Yeah. Knut Ivar, did you raise your hand again, or yes?
An additional comment. So I'm just building on the others, also assuming that some of you are new to nudging. So Benedicte said it correctly. So nudges are about this changing the environment so that the best choices are easiest to make. So you can just forget anything about psychology, but you can look at how the decision context looks like. What does the outer world look like? So then the logic is simple. So who influences sustainable and climate-friendly choices? Well, we need to see where the emissions come from and which categories destroy nature. So then that brings us always back to food and transportation and our houses and buildings. So those are the areas to nudge. So in terms of Ducky, you have taken on a very difficult task because Ola said, you know, people are impatient, hungry. You can go on a diet before lunch, but then you're hungry after lunch. You want to save money tomorrow, but today you want to have a good time. So you're working against the basic forces of human design, which is a difficult challenge. So the good thing or simple thing about nudges is about the world outside us. And in that world, we have 3 questions. Which options are available? In which order are they available? So what do we see first and last? And what information do we convey about the options? So that's Cass Sunstein's definition. And so this brings us back to websites where people buy stuff, either clothes that are full of plastic or whatever, and transported through oil-rich ships from China and the Far East. It's food service firms, and it's where people make transportation choices. And all of these things, when we start collecting what we already know, the recommendations are quite simple. So for example, where I live in Oslo, it's so expensive to drive the car. It costs like 50 crowns to drive the car across the city, but there's always a tram available every 5th minute. So for me, it's most convenient today to take the tram. When it's not snowy, it's always my bike. So this goes back to the 3 simple principles of nudging. It's the CAN, can. It's convenient, it's attractive, and it's normal. So what we will see now through in the electric transportation area is that now it's more normal to have an electric car than a gasoline or diesel car. More than 50% are doing it. So that's the same thing happened with smoking. You know, smoking was first regulated, but then it became a social norm not to smoke. And Helle, I have a question. Do you want me to answer it now in the chat, or do you want to give someone else the word?
I think we'll save the questions towards the end so that we get through this session first. And then I saw Benedicte raised her hand just when you started talking, Knut Ivar. So yeah, feel free to comment as well, Benedicte.
Well, so far we've talked about nudging consumers, but in Footprint we also look at nudging employees, because we also know that businesses need to develop and implement solutions. And businesses is not just a group, it's the sum of people working there. Managers and middle managers and people working on the floor. So we also look at when we want to implement change projects within a business, we also look at how can we nudge employees to change the businesses faster. For instance, we've worked with another electronics retailer. We saw that there in the salespeople's incentives, when someone came with a broken coffee maker, they would always advise the customers to buy a new coffee maker instead of repairing the old one, even though selling spare parts would give a higher margin to the company. It will the salespeople will get a better bonus if they sold a new one. So if we change the incentive structures for the salespeople, they will promote more sustainable actions for the consumers as well.
Yeah.
And we can get a system where we promote repair and circular economics instead of just buying new stuff.
So one question I want to raise that plays a bit into that is, in a way, the topic of how do we actually ensure socially responsible nudging? Because, of course, the old definition of a company is that it is a profit maximizing unit. And, of course, maximizing profit is not always in line with what's best for the world and people, at least in the short term. So you have examples of putting all of the candy in child's height towards the checkout of the supermarket, and making it easy to pay with a credit card. As the last time I bought something online, the default option was to buy it on credit. And you have all these, in a way, bad ways some companies use nudging to promote what we could say is bad behavior, at least for individuals and society in the long term. But how can we make sure that the nudging that is carried out is actually socially responsible? I think Mats was first with his hand, and then Knut Ivar.
Yes, so again, I can just refer to what we just set up, this Zero Emission Citizen project, because there we have like Sparebanken Alliance and Fjordkraft who is joining. And what we've seen is that they have focused a lot of their CSR efforts on reducing their own footprint, meaning that to reduce their transport of their employees, energy in buildings, etc. But we realize that it's so much powerful to do what Benedict is talking about, to make these employees and look for options where they can actually influence their customers, their end customers. So instead of kind of reducing this fraction of a footprint, they can influence 1.5 million Norwegians to reduce their footprints, and driving the demand for sustainability throughout the whole value chain from us spending money every day. So I think like if we can do that in a credible way to like create this or empower Sparebanken and other actors to see that, okay, we can actually influence society, make them proud of what they do, then it's very hard to kind of do this greenwashing, because it becomes part of their core business to say that, okay, everything they do becomes more sustainable, and everything has kind of an aim to influence their end customers to be part of this transition of our society. And Benedict said it very nicely, like we don't have the time to do nudging anymore. Like we are in a climate crisis, we need to act like we're in a climate crisis, and that means that we have to change how we do business. Whether you are kind of selling shoes, you should like try to repair shoes equally much as you sell new ones, etc. So this will, I think, dramatically change how we actually organize our cities and all the companies and farming, etc. So yeah, that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think Knut Ivar was first, and followed by Benedicte.
Yeah, so I have a couple of reactions. One is the last one. So nudging is one of the fastest way to change people's choices. So when you change the buffet, you immediately change the choice the same day. That's the fastest way to make any choice. If you want to inform people, you need to inform them multiple times over many months, and they might change behavior. So this brings us back to think about ourselves in this audience. How do we choose? The answer is simple. One way of choosing is to plan, as Ola talked about, the planning smart brain. But there's also an intermediate step, which is the pre-planning. So I plan to eat healthy, plan to go to the supermarket, and then I'm in the supermarket. So nudges or behavioral economics works in the two last steps. So it means that you can use, so in the climate psychologist, we have made a program called the behavioral economics of climate communication. So there you can use the same techniques when we inform people about most attractive, which are best for the climate. You can use behavioral economics to make people pre-plan also. So that's another step of the choice process. And the last thing is that when you look at business companies, some of them do this because of their CSR accounting, and they want to look good to the business environment and to their customers. But if you look deeply into companies, you need actually to make 4 kinds of changes to make the company more sustainable. It starts with the leaders. So what values do the leaders hold? So if the leaders don't care about the planet, they will make bad choices. Then you need to put the sustainability into the strategy and KPIs and measure it and put it into planning system. You need to review the value chain, how the emissions from the value chain come. And then the last part is the nudges of the consumers. So it's actually 4 or 5 sets of changes you need to make in a company to become more sustainable. But it starts with the whole value system of the leaders and the people who manage the company.
Thank you for that, Knut Ivar. Benedict was next, followed by Ole. So go ahead, Benedict.
Yes, I think we should be aware that there are some companies that uses the signs and placing and labeling, like Knut Ivar talked about earlier, to anti-nudge us into buying crap that is not sustainable. When 8 of 10 of us want to live more sustainably, it's easy to put on a little green sticker and call it sustainable. So we should be have a high alarm on greenwashing and always demand transparency, ask them to measure and report the effects and the true footprint. But for many of the companies we work with, we help them look for sort of triple wins. If we go back to the very first example I talked about the tumble dryers, about the Elkjøp study, we saw that Elkjøp would help consumers buy a little more expensive tumble dryers, but in the long run the consumers would save money because it was more energy efficient and it would cut emissions. So it was sort of a triple win. And we see many of the triple win examples, but transparency is key.
Yeah, go ahead, Ola.
Okay, yeah. So I think we must, if we look at the situation now, compared to just some years ago, I think we have reasons to be more optimistic. And I think a lot of the norm changing that has been, that we have gone through the last, say, 5-10 years, which is also results from nudging, is now we see that the real big capital flows are moving into to green and environmental prospects to much larger than extent. So this focus now on ESG that firms have is a big change, and also if you look at the Paris Agreement, actually I think there is some behavioral economics insight to that, because many mainstream economists was really not impressed at all by the Paris Agreement, because it was too little of the hard regulation. But what we have got is more of a competition in a sense between countries to actually do good. And finally, I would say there is a clear change now in how also economists think about profit maximization. So from Milton Friedman, we say that, okay, we maximize social surplus by maximizing profit, but this has a big change now. Shareholders see firms as a way of doing good. to a larger extent than previously. So there are reasons to believe that much of the nudge thinking that has been going for a while, for 10 years now, give larger results, and also complements very well incentives and hard regulation.
Thank you for that insight, Ola, and it's good to hear that companies are looking a bit wider into how they can do good in the world. One question that I want to end this session with before we have some questions from the audience. So I see in the audience that we have people from companies and people from municipalities, some working in academia, but what kind of general advice would you give to someone working in either a company or in the public sector that want to learn more about nudging and maybe also implement it in their work, especially if they're working with customers? How should they get started to learn more about this and then in turn implement it in practice? And then I think Knut Ivar was first with his hand this time.
So my experience is that it's a good idea to try to find out when do your customers make the choice that you want to influence. So what's the situation that the customer is in, and what is the customer doing then? So what you could do then is to have a talk with some of the customers, how they think about their choice, and then match it with a list of nudges, and then see if you can change the situation in any way, but also measure after you have changed it, test the effect of the change you're making. So I'm partly addressing the question from Björn, a very good question. So the answer there is that we try to, in the early days of Green Nudge, try to influence people's energy consumption at home. But we got into the resistance that Ola talked about. So when do people make energy choices at home, and how many times per day or year do they make those choices? Well, for most people, energy is so cheap, it's green, so that it's very far down on their list of something they want to think about every day. And so, which means that if you want to influence people's energy choices, you need to find ways to change when they, let's say, use energy during the day, have some kind of appliance for the tumbler, so that they use the tumbler in the middle of the day and not in the evening when everyone else is using it. So we ended up with, trying to change people's everyday behavior in energy. It was very, very difficult because people weren't interested in it. We worked with Energy Norway, that organizes the energy producers, and we just said, this is too much. We gave up. So the short answer is find out when is the customer making the decision, change the decision situation, and measure the effect.
That sounds like a good recipe. Any other wants to give any comments to that before we move on to the questions? Yeah, Mats, you also.
Yes, so for my part, I would love for more companies to, I really liked what you said, Knut Ivar, about these 4 things, like that the companies have to go through, like to anchor it with leadership's KPIs, etc., and trying to do stuff like engaging your employees, but then also kind of as part of this process, maybe you could map out what is your handprint potential, right? So in what kind of, how can the services or product you are making, how can they contribute for making it more easy to live sustainable for your customers? So just kind of trying to know, maybe even quantify what is the potential there, and start testing it. Is this something the customers want? And for instance, SMN is kind of doing this now and saying, okay, what will be the effect of sustainable loans, etc. So, and how can that help our customers live more sustainable? So I really love that kind of approach. So I hope more companies can do that. And for municipalities, policymakers, I really hope that they can join the network. Right now with this SEC project, we will have networks in 5 district counties going forward. So if you're interested in trying to join the initiative from your district county, and so that we can learn different stories, different part of Norway, what is working, and make sure that we take best practices from Trøndelag and move it to what they are doing now in Rogaland, etc., so that we can really get best practices and get things moving really fast.
So it's my turn again.
Yes.
I'm reacting to what you just said, Mats. So think about who influences our behavior the most. Well, it's actually the leader and the workplace. So in terms of food and transportation, companies can do a lot. So we've found that what people eat at lunch, they bring that habit back home and want to serve their family the same good food. Companies can do a lot to influence transportation to work, which is a big source of emissions. So I think there's a way here for business organizations to influence their employees. And if you look at who influences us at home, it's of course the neighbor. So I think there are lots of things that companies can do to nudge employees at work, to influence them to change behavior at home and to work, which together will make a significant impact. Also using tools like Ducky and similar apps and things to measure and stimulate good choices.
Thank you for that. I see that we have partially answered some of the questions from the audience. So let's start with one of the questions from Mehdi Torkaman, which is as follows. So how do we make sure that long-term nudging does not dull the citizens' ability to hold experts accountable when it comes to setting the default for given periods? Can making choices too easy contribute to a form of political laziness? So anyone want to react to that one? Ola was first.
I can say, I think this is some of those who are skeptical to the whole ideas of nudging, at least from the politician side, has argued along those lines. And what I think is that it's important, as I also said in my talk, it's really important to be transparent about why one do what one do. Why do we communicate the way we do? Why do we set the options the way we do? So that we are open on if we want to have sustainable options up front, and then policymakers are open about it. So these things are transparent. I think that's really important. And the other thing is as I also want to stress, is that nudges and incentives are complements, not substitutes. So one should do both.
Yes. I see we have some more questions. Some of them are quite long. I see, Björn, you have a couple of questions. Would you like to ask one of them just directly in person, one or two of the questions? I can unmute you if that's all right. Oh, it looks like your sound is a bit. Well, I can translate and ask. Or one of them was directly to Knut Ivar. Do you just want to answer Björn's question that was directed towards you?
Well, the first one I think I partly answered.
Yeah.
It's so let's say you work in an energy company or any other organization. The solution is to identify when can we influence the consumer's choice, and then what can we do in that situation to make people choose differently. So one part that's maybe relevant for some companies is to say that our solutions are more sustainable than the competitors, and therefore you need to label your options as greener than the others to make people aware of that in the choice moment. So if you look at any website, some things will always be salient, let's say price, or it's how green things are, or it's number of days before you get it in the mail and all that. So I think companies need to be aware of how can they use sustainability and climate friendliness on their websites to make people aware that they're making a good or a bad choice. So it's not always that the cheapest things like Benedict talked about, the cheapest tumblers were the most environmentally big enemies, whereas the more expensive tumblers, they were better in the long run. But people at Elkjøp didn't know, because no one told them about that. They just noticed the price.
Yeah.
So the principle is the same. Look at the situation. So here in front of me, you can call me. I think I have a list of maybe 25 things you can test. So there's an almost unlimited number of different things, but you need to have your mind straight about what choices do you want to change and what do you expect to have the biggest impact on those choices.
Yeah.
I'm just talking as you don't stop me. So the biggest thing, like I just reinforcing what Ola said, the default is a good thing. People do take the default. They take today's course in the restaurant, at a website, if it says, today's product, this week's discount, oh, that's a good thing. These things are, very basic things that always tend to work. People buy more of the stuff on a website that has a big picture relative to small picture. People like looking at other people. So if you want to sell something, show a picture of a happy person eating the thing or doing the thing, and people will want to look at that instead of just the thing. So there are so many different things you can do. So if you're interested, I'm a columnist in Dine Penger, the magazine. And for one of my clients, I made a course in climate communication. And I just transformed that into a paper of, I think, 20 things you can do in your marketing to influence people, to influence what people buy. And all of those things you can just use directly in your company's website to make people's choices different.
Yeah, that's interesting insight. A comment from Benedict as well.
We keep talking about nudging as something we sort of push on the consumers, but there is a real consumer pull as well. We work with the company kolonial.no, which you might know, and their customers, they come to them and say, we want you to help us make more sustainable choices. How can you do that? They recently launched a climate receipt, which is sort of, you can go back and look at your purchases and see whether they're green or yellow or red, depending on their climate footprint. And there's a real push or pull from the consumers, help us make more sustainable choices. It's not just the companies that sort of push them out.
Yeah. So one quick comment from me, and also before I go to the next question. So one of the takeaways that I thought was quite interesting from reading the book Nudge by Richard Taylor was that we humans care much more about losses than about gains. So remember one of the examples they gave with regards to saving energy, for example, if it's framed like, if you turn down your indoor temperature, you will save 500 kroners per year. That can motivate people somehow, but if it's turned the other way, that you will lose 500 kroners per year if you don't do this, that's more effective. So that's a comment from me, and also maybe some of you have some insights into why it is that we care so much more about losses than about wins.
I'm talking too much. So the answer is simple. It's evolution. So in evolution, it paid off to be negative. So you looked at things that were wrong, looked at changes that could threaten you. So in our whole mind and our whole system, there's a negativity bias. So people notice negative information faster than positive. There's an information highway into the mind about threats. Nerve impulses actually go faster. Kahneman writes about that negative memories have bigger space in the brain. We have more negative feelings than positive ones. It means that our positive ancestors were eaten. They're not here. The genes are gone.
Yeah, so thank you for that.
Mature answer in terms of what Ola might say, who is a scientist, but this is the psychological perspective. We're hardwired to avoid bad things and to achieve good things.
I think we have some time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I see Gunn Christine was quite early, but it was quite a long question, but now she's simplified my job by narrowing down the question. So she asked, sticks seems to be more of a common tool for policy making, but can also be the route for resistance and policy backlash. How important will more use of carrots and nudging be in the long term?
Me again? I'm back to the health nudging. So, Norway is famous for the sugar fee on rolls and chocolates and sodas and all that. So a couple of years ago, I did a study and we looked at fast food in Norway. How does the sugar fee influence what people buy? Well, it turned out that 3 rolls and a soda with sugar, that costs 30 crowns. And water and a baguette costs 80 crowns. So the value chain and the fee on the sugar has no impact on the consumer. It's just a useless fee because it doesn't nudge the consumer away from bad stuff and towards good stuff. So people in Norway are so rich that we don't care if a roll costs less or more. We just want the roll. We're hungry. We see it, we take it. So therefore, some of the things that policymakers do, they sit in the office and listen to people like Ola, experts, but they're not out in the real world and see how people make the choices. They need to listen more to Ola, that, look at how people in Norway actually make choices, use behavioral economics because people are irrational, but, don't, incentivize this or punish that if it doesn't influence people in the end. It's useless. It makes just people angry and negative and blah, blah, blah.
Okay, I see that we have some more questions, but I really don't want to go over time. So that means that I think it's time to end this event. It's been very interesting to hear from all of you and also the discussion at the end. Of course, this is a very wide topic, but I think it's important for almost everyone to know more about how we humans behave, and especially how irrational we behave sometimes, and how we can design the world in a way that helps us achieve some of the biggest challenges that we are facing. So with that, I would just want to thank you all for coming here today. I see there is some questions in the chat. Maybe if some of the panelists have time left, they could write some responses there. Or of course, feel free to reach out to them if you want to get in touch and learn more about how they can help you. So thank you all for coming here today, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.